Please join me in welcoming Bryan Thompson.
Thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be able to give this talk today. I prepared this talk a year ago for one of the smaller towns in the county, and 2 days before I was about to give it, I got a call from the historian saying her museum board had ordered her to cancel it because nobody in St. Lawrence County will want to hear anything about this talk. So you're about to hear A.M. talk. I'd like to start with these two pictures because they're a perfect analogy for why we don't know about the history of slavery in New York or in St. Lawrence County. The picture on the right, to my right, to your left, is how the picture was originally purchased and displayed in a museum. Eventually, the New York Metropolitan Museum, I believe, started to examine the picture, and when they cleaned it, they discovered that a person had been painted out of the picture deliberately. And that is exactly what happened to the history of slavery and a lot of our Black population in this country. They were deliberately wounded. It wasn't an accident. So we'll start here. Here we have A.M.E. PK, who is the founder for the presentation. The first African American enslaved people came to St. Lawrence County with A.M.E. PK, with the first non-indigenous settlement of St. Lawrence County. He was accompanied by his Black man, Charles. And Charles was a very interesting character. From the records, he spoke 6 languages. He was in charge of building the construction of the outside battlements of the fort. And there was a Black woman present at the presentation who was only described as the midwife Negus. And from what we can tell, she was probably his wife. And when A.M.E. PK went back to visit the French court for Louis XV, Charles accompanied him back on the ship from Nova Scotia to France. And probably during much of what A.M.E. PK accomplished would be because of the help of these enslaved Black people, because then he didn't have to worry about daily tasks that normal human beings did because they were taking care of them. Besides him, Paul Francois Lagarde, who was the next abbey to come to the presentation, came with his enslaved man, Anselme, who was baptized in 1749. Other French officers in the fort are also held slaves. Interestingly, Anselme was by Lagarde's side during the Battle of Fort Levi, and he died just less than 6 weeks later at the hospital in Montreal, probably of wounds received during that battle, because my understanding of the battle is that none of the French protectors of the fort survived without severe wounds. New York State, the colony of New York, was a major slave-owning state. We don't really acknowledge that, but at the time of the American Revolution, there were more slaves in what was the New York colony than in any other colony north of the Mason-Dixon line. And New York colony had some of the most draconian slave laws in the entire colonies, much more severe than many of the southern colonies. And it was because of the slave revolt in 1712 they passed these laws. No African Americans could meet in any group of more than 3 people. They were not allowed to marry. They were not allowed to have their own churches or any kind of social institutions. And so, there were a few plantations in New York, mostly in Suffolk County on Long Island and in the Hudson River Belt. But most of the enslaved people in the New York colony were house slaves who dwelled in the attic or the basement of the house, was where they were housed. And population decline was always a problem because it was considered that people didn't want to waste their money having enslaved people get married and have children. That was an extra expense. So it was a pretty lonely existence to be an enslaved person in the New York colonies. One of the few organizations that the enslaved people were allowed to have under the New York colonial laws were burial societies, because that meant that the owners of the enslaved people didn't have to pay to bury their property when they were no longer of any use to them. So they allowed burial societies who could then take care of the last rites for members of the community. I've talked about some of these things already. Slavery was abolished gradually in New York, as it was in Philadelphia and many of the other northern communities. The only state, once the American Revolution happened, that actually immediately ended slavery without gradual abolition was Massachusetts. And just as when Massachusetts looked at their constitution and said a few years ago and said, oh, gay marriage is permitted, you can't forbid it under a Massachusetts constitution. The same thing happened with the state constitution when they wrote it in 1777. An enslaved person sued, and their Supreme Court said, oh, we wrote this constitution in such a manner that we're not allowed to enslave people in the state of Massachusetts. They were the only ones that had a clear cutoff with slavery. Gradual abolition was a horrible burden on the community in New York State, even though they put various things in place to try and buffer the effect. It really meant economically that the whole African American community in New York State was in limbo until after slavery was ended. The Act of 1788, they banned the sale of slaves. And so instead, they sold enslaved people for 99-year indentures. And that was a legal loophole they got around when they banned the sale of slaves. In 1799, they passed a law that said all enslaved people born in the state after July 4th, 1799 would be free. Males at 28, females at 25. And they initially, it's only people born after that date that are going to be free. And the rationale was, unscrupulous slave owners would work their property almost to death and then dump them on the public dole. And so initially it was only for the younger part of the population. But in 1817, they declared that all slaves born before July 4th, 1799 would be freed on July 4th, 1827. All children of slaves born up to July 3rd, 1827 were required to serve a 21-year indenture to their master to pay for their being raised. Okay. One of the clauses, just to show this one, The abandonment clause was part of the 1799 Gradual Abolition Act, and it provided a provision for owners of enslaved mothers to abandon the enslaved child on the public dole at the age of 1, and then take them in and be paid $3.50 per month for housing the indigenous black child. Now, this black child would not have to go through the indenture, but in that fact, it was the state paying them for this person. And it was so popular that in 1801, they reduced it to $3 a month. And then it was still too popular, it was costing the state too much money. So they, in 1802, it was reduced, and finally in 1804, they got rid of this clause altogether. But those people who signed up early got those payments until the child came of age. And one of the clauses was that if someone did, since the slave trade was ending, they made a clause that if you brought an enslaved person into New York State after 1799, you had to swear an oath with the county judge that you were not bringing them here just to sell, so there would be a trade. And so this is the actual statement from county records from the Court of Common Pleas when it said, this is as it were, be it remembered that personally appeared before me Nathan Ford Esquire, first judge of St. Lawrence County, David Ford, who happened to be his brother, who, being duly sworn, deposeth and saith that he was an inhabitant of Morris in the state of New Jersey for the year last, before the beginning of May last passed, and resided with his family therein, and that he removed into the said county of St. Lawrence in the month of June last, with intent to reside therein. That he brought with him from New Jersey a female slave by the name of Jude, of the age of 11 years, which female slave he had owned for at least 1 year before his removal into this state, and further saith now. And interestingly, that's the only record we have of Judy or Judy. It may be phonetically Judy. I'm not clear on that. However, many times our enslaved African Americans in St. Louis kinds of records are very slim. There's some who appear on censuses and nowhere else, and others who only appear in diaries and court records, and etc. The Van Rensselaers were proprietors of Canton of more slaves than any other family in New York State. The Van Rensselaers, Coopers, Delancey's, Ogden, Smiths, Daubinese, and other landlords were seasonal visitors to the North Country, accompanied by their black servants. Enslaved people such as Joseph Stewart and Christopher Rush made it possible for the owners to visit and develop their holdings in St. Lawrence County. Christopher Rush is probably the most famous person who was enslaved in St. Lawrence County. He went on to become A.M.E. Methodist minister, and he was the bishop of New York City for the A.M.E. Methodist Church. He was enslaved by David Ogden family, and when he died in the early 1870s, in his 90s, they wrote in his obituary, they came with David Ogden when the only building in what is today Ogdensburg was the old French fort, or the old British fort, sorry. And he, when he died in New York, 3,000 people attended his funeral. He helped spread the A.M.E. Zion Church in Connecticut and in New Jersey. And he also, his church in New York was known as the Freedom Church because they were involved with the Underground Railroad. And he said once that he sent fugitives who came through his church to the north to lands with which I am familiar. And this is mostly to show an image. Joseph Stewart, who was enslaved by Judge William Cooper of Cooperstown. The judge owned the town of De Kalb, and he owned parts of the town of Messina. And Joseph is in the background here with William's wife. It's very hard in these early times to find images. There were many enslaved people. This is from the census of 1810, and there are many others who aren't listed on that census, such as the early record of Ogdensburg talks about Nathan Ford and had a slave named Dick. And Dick, supposedly, the first year they celebrated the 4th of July in Ogdensburg, he dove in the Oswegatchie River and found one of the old French cannons that had been dumped in the river. And he found it, and they pulled it out of the river, but it was his swimming that found it. And they pulled it out of the river, and they used to fire it to celebrate the 4th of July. Now, just today, I received it was from John Austin, but from Nathan Ford's papers, there's a letter where Nathan Ford wrote to an owner of enslaved people downstate. And it turns out Dick had gotten this man's female slave pregnant. And Nathan Ford's offering to buy the person for, I think, 50 pounds. But I just found that out today. And then you only find these pieces here and there, just as the picture disappeared. David Judson from Judson Street is named for it here in Canton, was the second largest holder of enslaved people in St. Lawrence County. And it was a status symbol to have a house slave. So the wealthiest people all had slaves. So, and most of the early officers in our county owned enslaved people. There's only 1 or 2 slaves. These were that were enslaved by the Hasbrook family. Lewis Hasbrook was our first county clerk, and for many years, and a lawyer and a judge. And I happened to find that they have Hasbrook papers in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the University of Michigan. And in these papers, there are letters written between Catherine Hasbrook's sisters and herself, and there's always a PS where they send messages back and forth to their enslaved people. And Nanny, who this is about, her bill of sale was included in the Hasbrook papers in the Ogdensburg Public Library. But I include these because it's a human face. We have very little human face. Nanny was born in the household of Catherine Banks' parents in Ulster County. Her father was Jerry, a slave in the Banks household. She grew up with Catherine and came into the Hasbrook household when Lewis Hasbrook first got the clerk, married Catherine in 1802. In 1804, Lewis finally built a house for his wife and his family to move here. And they tell the accounts that they came and they walked most of the way behind the ox cart with Nanny. They were accompanied by his brother Joseph and a female cousin. And the roads were so bad after Carthage that they had to abandon their cart. They used pack horses and walked from Carthage to Ogdensburg. And this building over here on the end was at the end of Ford Street near the Oswegatchie River, and that's the Hasbrook house. And so if you walk down Ford Street in Ogdensburg today, you're walking where enslaved people walked and lived. And some more things. This is from the brother Joseph to Louis from a letter after their father died, which is again how people disappear. I looked at their father's will. There's no mention of enslaved people in the will at all, but yet Joseph wrote, Philip, who's another brother of theirs, took Dick, Har, and Toby along with him. I kept none of the old stock except Janet. Dinah and Singo moved away the same time and are commencing housekeeping near Abraham Hadenberg. When I got rid of the old stock, I immediately went out and purchased a black man, a woman, and 2 children. That tells you the old stock. That tells you how these people were considered. Even right here in St. Lawrence County, where we like to think that we were never part of slavery. And then again, on July 8th, if you recollect my Negro man right away when I was sick, I have not got him yet. I have sent to Boston and New York after him, who could not find it. A few other tidbits from the letters between the Hasbrook family members. Diana and Phyllis says, I must let Nanny know that they have handsome new calico frocks. And then later, the kids you folk are all well. Francis and York have made a visit lately of a fortnight and all send their love to Nanny. Diana sends her love to Nanny and says she has a new gown too from the city of New York, very handsome and cheap, though not made up yet. Sometimes enslaved people were referred to almost like family. In this case, David Hasbrook, Lewis's brother, writes he's concerned about Nanny because Nanny had become pregnant in 1812. And I beg that you write us as soon as convenient and can inform me. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a prior case. He's worried about the health of Nanny and says, you should do this to take care of Nanny. And then New York State had very strict slave control laws, and that kids forbid social organizations, as I mentioned, and no enslaved person could legally marry in New York State without their owner's permission. And the Church of England, later the Episcopal Church, refused to perform marriages in New York State for enslaved people at all. The Dutch Reformed Church did, and the Dutch had allowed African Americans to marry freely up until the Duke of York took over the state. And that's what this about is talking about it. Pompey has had a mind to come into the chambers to see Miss Diana, but was found out and looked like a squirrel that is tree running over the roof. I after him in my chemise. And then Lasher wrote, I was offered $12 for Pompey, but would not sell at that price. So you start the feeling of what the lives for these people were like. And this is when they were starting to worry about Nanny. And Nanny had been raised with their family from a little child. And when Nanny was pregnant, Uncle Graham thinks that by all means, Louis better get out with his family. I think it would be more convenient for Nanny when she has a young one to take care of. However, I suppose you must know best for how secure you can be from there. And this letter was written just as the British had their first attempt on Ogdensburg was a fleet of boats, which was repulsed. And right after that, Louis stayed, but the rest of his family went down to Dutchess County. And Nanny gave birth to a son in Hurley, New York on November 13th, 1812. And this upset Catherine Hasbrook very much. She was so mortified that this woman had a child in their household that she insisted that Nanny be sold. and letters went back and forth between Lewis and her, but eventually he agreed, and this is the bill of sale for Nanny when she was sold to this house in Dutchess County, the owner of this house. So this is a place she would have gone to dwell. And the start thing about this, I think you will see, is that the child has no name. And the child is a year old almost at this point, and still referred to as her male child. There's no personification of this child. And after that, Lewis bought Sharp, who became Richard Sharp. They always refer to him in family records as Sharp, but he became Richard Sharp. And this is the bill of sale when they bought Sharp to come and live with them. And this is one time when Lewis wrote a letter to give an idea of what kinds of things Sharp was doing. I wish you would let Sharp plant some more beans on the 1/4 acre opposite the asparagus bed. Please tell Sharp to put the wagon out of the weather in the barn. And after helping you as much as you want, let him attend to his pouring on the new lawn. He would go on to live as a free man in Ogdensburg and marry. In 1830, he was married with one son and 2 daughters. Polly and Jane Sharp were still living in Ogdensburg, working as household servants in 2 different households in 1850. But that's as far as I can trace them. I've not been able to find out what his son's name was. And like most of the early African Americans in St. Lawrence County, they're probably buried here, but there are no grave markers. One of the ways we find out about different enslaved people that were here in St. Lawrence County is through letters. And this happens to talk about was Isaac Cooper, who was the son of William Cooper, took over managing the land in De Kalb. And during this incident, and he's referred to as your black man. In a letter of March 16th, 1813, from Mr. Gregory of Albany, it seems that Cooper's man was suspected of stealing William's hat, Mr. Gregory's mate. The hat stolen was a gentleman's hat costing $6 or $7 that had been given to William by Lieutenant Frederick de Poyster. It had been replaced by a shabby, worn-out hat. The exchange was witnessed by another man's servant. A pair of blue broadcloth pantaloons were also missing. And Rich's Negro boy, this is one in De Kalb. The only record we have of Rich's enslaved person was from a mortgage. He used him as collateral in the mortgage, and then interestingly, his collateral in the mortgage with his mother. His mother remarried, and under property rights, the enslaved person now belonged to the new stepfather. The stepfather obviously didn't like Sienna Rich very much and refused to return this person. And this is an attempt in a letter to have him return to the family here. Okay. And this gives you an example after 1830 that of the African Americans and where they were living in St. Lawrence County after they were freed in 1827. One thing I want to mention about the census, which sort of shows to me how people thought of African Americans here. The 1820 census was done on a wide format piece of paper with columns, and down the middle was a divider. And this half were white people, this half were black people. All that remains of St. Lawrence County, this half was removed with black people on it. And the older microfilm has a little strip at the bottom with the totals for each town of African Americans. So they literally threw away the black census of 1820 for St. Louis County. Governor Ogden owned more slaves than any other person who lived year-round in the county. His brother David owned more slaves, but he spent more than half the year in New York City. In Charlotte's diary, she noted on March 22nd, 1827, now the people they're talking about here were to be fully free on the 4th of July of 1827. Father, meaning Governor Morris, sold the two blacks for $200. A pretty good bargain. Had a melancholy party. I bet it was melancholy for those two people who were sold back into lifetime slavery. And there's no record of Ogden ever being fined the $200 for illegally selling them out of New York State. But that happened in New York State, part of gradual abolition. The population of African Americans in New York State between 1799 and 1820 was cut in half. Many enslaved people were sold. The only case I know someone actually prosecuting was Sojourner Truth. I think everybody knows who she was, right? She was, I believe, the first woman and the first African American to successfully sue her former owner and get her son back from the South, where he'd been sold into slavery. So slavery in St. Lawrence County ends on July 4th, 1827. However, some of the laws still say, in fact, because all these black men were becoming free, women couldn't vote, so they didn't count. But the legislature, and just before this happened in New York, passed the law. Up until 1822, you had to own $50 worth of property in order to be a voter. They got rid of the requirement for white men and black men. They increased the amount of property they had to own to $250 in order to vote. That they tried twice to repeal that in the 1840s and the 1860s. They tried to repeal that. That poll tax in New York State was not removed until the passage of the 14th Amendment. Wow. Okay, thank you. This concludes my talk. Do you have any questions for me? Yes, ma'am.
Going back to the selling, because in 1788 specifically, you said that they were not allowed to do the slave trade anymore. So are we talking about just the transatlantic slave trade, or they can still buy and sell within New York?
Inside New York, you weren't able to sell as a slave, but instead it was
as this indenture.
99-year indenture.
So all of the examples that you provided happened after the not all, but a good majority of them happened after the 1788 delineation, but they're obviously still going all around in the circles anyway.
Well, I had someone who gave this talk who read about Nanny's bill of sale. So, she was just an indentured servant. It says indenture for 10 years. But the reason for 10 years was, well, emancipation was coming. And so people were starting to, well, we'll get 10 years labor and then they'll be emancipated. Yes.
So in the case of a runaway slave from a southern state,
yes,
it somehow made it to New York State before or after 1827. Were people in New York State obligated legally to help return?
Yes, the first Fugitive Slave Act was passed in the 18th century, the national law. And so there were penalties, and we're supposed to in Pennsylvania, even though they had gradual abolition before New York, about 10 years earlier, George Washington, when he lived there as president, rotated his slaves because they had a law that if the slaves stayed there for more than 6 months, they weren't slaves anymore. So he rotated his slaves from his plantation back and forth to his household staff. There were all kinds of loopholes to get around.
but then there was a underground railroad.
No underground rail. At that point, for one thing, people forget there was slavery in Canada until 1834. However, in Upper Canada, there was a whole lot less slavery than there had been because they had a very clever colonial governor in 1790s who got them to pass a law that you had to include in your will means to take care of your enslaved people after you passed away so they wouldn't go on the public dole. That was a law where they could attach your estate. So a lot of people in Upper Canada started having servants who were paid rather than enslaved people because there was a financial penalty when you died and they wanted to make protect their inheritance. And that's how one of the few families that could, this is beyond the enslaved portion, but in my book, the Boston family from Messina were one of the few families where they had enough money to vote. The reason was that, I forget the wings' names, but Mr. Boston's mother-in-law had been enslaved by a member of the provincial parliament in Upper Canada, and he died in a shipwreck, and so she got money, and there was a clause to take care of her, so they got property, which they sold, and then her daughter had money when she married, I think it's Richard Boston was her husband's name. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so forgive me. And so she had money and they purchased land, and it was that purchase of land which came because of an Upper Canada law that they actually had capital. Because one of the barriers around here was that many white landowners wouldn't sell land to African Americans to get that foot in the door to move up the economic ladder. You find almost, I've taken the cessation records and looked at them and compared them to the deeds. And you just don't find almost any of them.
So slavery ends officially in 1827. So at what point do people in St. Lawrence County become interested in abolition? National abolition of slavery?
Well, actually, well, there's little pieces. I'll talk about that. First thing I can tell you is Governor Morris, who owned Governor, was an abolitionist. And when they wrote the first state constitution in 1777, I believe was the year, he introduced a resolution to end slavery in New York State, and it was defeated. And because of that, he left New York State and moved to Philadelphia to live with the Quakers who were opposed to slavery. And so that would be like the first connection I can find to abolition. Then the second one would be there was a Presbyterian minister in Potsdam who in 1826 did a sermon about the evils of slavery. You wouldn't know that from northern New York, but the entire text of the sermon was published in a black newspaper in New York City at the time. So there were rumblings, but they were the oddballs. It was a tiny minority. People like to glorify the Underground Railroad and think everybody was an abolitionist. St. Lawrence County didn't become major abolitionists until the 1850 passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was so blatantly. There were radicals here. I mean, the Liberty Party ran candidates here in elections in the 1840s, and there were 1830s abolitionist petitions, but it was a tiny minority of people. It wasn't until after the Fugitive Slave Act that sort of the snowball started rolling down the hill.
I missed part of that, but there was one question in the chat. Someone was asking about the Underground Railroad in St. Lawrence County and said their friend thought they had a stone house that was part of it.
Depends what it is and whether you can. There's lots of rumors about the Underground Railroad, and it's hard to document. And it's very romantic. People that aren't interested in Black civil rights or anything else want to have a house on the Underground Railroad. It's really about the abolitionists. And a lot of them were African American. The Underground Railroad really was run by African Americans with white help. Because they were the ones who had the skin in the game. I hate to use that analogy, but they did. These were their family members. And so people, there's a reason for that. And there were some, there were a lot of people involved. The best documented Underground Railroad operative in this county, nobody ever talks about, is George McEwen, because there's no house associated with him. And George McEwen, in his obituary in the 1870s, they boasted about him being a conductor on the Underground Railroad. You know, they were proud of it. They were Free Will Baptists and they were abolitionists and worked with the Underground Railroad. When stories come up almost 100 years after that, they may or may not be true.
I have a question. Back when you said Mrs. Hasbro got rid of the nanny because of the child, is there any mention of the color of the child and why did she get rid of it because of the color of the child?
She mentions that it's white. Or she also mentions, I didn't put it in your whole talk on Nanny and Ogdensburg, she would not look at the child. She was so appalled and complained that Nanny would be nursing that baby in the scullery and in the chambers and she was just disgusted with the whole thing. But the ironic part is back then rich people like Catherine did laying in when they gave birth, which meant they just stayed in bed for a week or two or more after the birth. And Nanny would have been one that she had 5 kids, and Nanny was the one who took care of her for having those 5 girls.
Thanks.
So there's lots more about Nanny, but it all depends. I gave the talk in Ogdensburg, and one person said they could understand why Catherine Banks was so mortified because people would think her husband was a philanderer. And even though there were letters where he swore to her that he wasn't the father of the child, and Nanny always refused to tell her who the father of the child was, and she was really angry about that.
Is there a way to access your research, like that you use for this? Just in the book, but there's no like
Mostly
digital.
in the book.
Okay.
And it took 15 years for the book, and there's little pieces like the part about Nathan Ford's enslaved man that just came today. They're just hidden all around, and I took 15 years putting together what I could, and I'm sure there's things I left out. There's no doubt about it.
Bryan, your book has a good bibliography at the end.
Yes, it does.
That's what I wanted to.
It's all the archives and stuff. Because it seems very strange to me that half the Hasbro papers are in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the other half are in the basement of the Augsburg Public Library. So, well, thank you, everybody.